So as mentioned by Rachel, the general plan is I'm asked to stick to 1 hour, which I think is fair enough. And I did wonder whether to show this documentary that you're going to see. 2 reasons. One is it's 45 minutes, which is a bit on the long side. Secondly, it was actually shown in public domain in 2016-17. Some of you might have seen it. So the documentary is called Operation Sumatran Rhino. In a moment I'll give some context. And it's a great documentary. It was produced by a Singaporean, Chris Sanadorai, and a Malaysian, Lydia Lubon, who spent a lot of time with us in my NGO, Borneo Rhino Alliance, in that time, 2013, 14, 15, 16, documenting what my NGO was doing with this species, the Sumatran rhino, largely in Sabah, or not entirely. And they did a very good job. I was very pleased indeed. But I guess it's typical of any documentary. It's great, but it's emotion based, and it's based on it's creating a story, which doesn't give them much bigger context. So I want to give that background, maybe the bigger context. So in fact, suddenly I'm going to cheekily ask a few questions. They're rhetorical questions. You don't have to answer. So the first one is I'm looking around at the demography, age, structure, and sex ratio. So how many of us here remember before internet, when everything was by letters and postage stamps? Oh, most. Well, even you really? Oh,
Nokia.
Okay. So what else would there be? Another one would be another one that applies to some of us. Do you remember when there were no such thing as plastic bags? Yes. What? Do you?
Yes.
You're much older than I thought in that case. It came in about 1963 from my memory anyway. Maybe you were a baby at that time.
Yes.
So another one, there is a purpose to this rhetorical question. So that my final sort of rhetorical question is, do you remember 1894, the big debate in City of London, UK, and City of New York, where concerns were emerging in the 1890s about the coming 20th century? And the big problem was going to be what to do with horse manure. Both those cities had more than 50,000 working horses every day, another 50,000 stables. And the big thing, every day there was about 800 tons of horse manure being dropped in the streets. So little did anyone know that there was going to be the internal combustion engine coming 2 or 3 years later. So it was a big element of debate. My point of giving these rhetorical questions is that perhaps referring to my title, perhaps the single in many spheres of life, but particularly in wildlife management or wildlife conservation, I think the single biggest cognitive bias, if I may put it that way, is called the shifting baseline syndrome. The shifting baseline syndrome, which you may have read of, and it's a very simple concept, but hardly known because it's so basic. It is that all of us view the world and everything in it in our own lifetime. So even the older ones amongst us can only sort of remember maybe 50 years back, that sort of time frame, and maybe we can imagine 5 years ahead. But if one wants to think of managing populations, in this case of the rhino, which would be the topic of this documentary, one needs a much bigger time frame. So to explain what I mean in the context of this so-called Sumatran rhinoceros, the subject of the documentary. So if we could have been around 20,000 years ago, which is a very short time in geological history, we could have walked from here, which would have then been Ditrichar forest, all the way to Bangkok, for example. There's a great plains which would have been stuffed with elephants, Indian rhinos, Javan rhinos, Sumatra rhinos, tigers, leopards, the whole lot. And then there was a entirely natural rise in sea level by about 120 meters between about 20,000 and 27,000 years ago. Nothing to do with humans. So that wiped out at least half of the habitat of the Sumatran rhino. If you go back, if we could have gone back 5,000 years ago, which would be 3000 BC, this so-called Sumatran rhino would have been called the Asian rhino because it was the rhino of Southeast Asia, and it was widespread spread throughout Southeast Asia, including the southwestern, no one really knows, but the southwestern, maybe 20 or 30% of what is now China. It was there. And it was very much in demand in China 3,000 years ago, because its skin, its hide, was used for armor. And this was the days before, even before crossbows came, before firearms, right? So the skin of this rhino, that was, in my view, no one really knows. Maybe you know, most likely. But the big use was the skin. Meat would have been supplementary, and I sort of suspect that the horn, which everyone thinks rhinos have been poached for, was probably some marketing scam, well pre-digital. So we've got all these thousands of horns. What are you going to do with them? And the good thing is they're very small, lightweight. You can keep them for 100 years, nothing changes. So they're very easy to put in a box and send them on a post horse. So they could have been traded, and I'm sure the scam of these were medicinal products came around 3,000 years ago. If you want to introduce your...
One little thing. When I was little, I remember my mom always went to local Chinese traditional medicine shops.
Yes.
And then and buy a bunch of herbs for my sister's skin disease.
Yes.
And one of the things that she specifically asked for is rhino skin. I'm not sure whether that's rhino skin. I was really young.
Yeah, sure.
And then at times there was also in this herbs together with where there's a piece of dry toad. Yeah. Toad. Yeah.
Frog.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then CUP and capsule CUP. In Chinese it's 三T 土夫 capsule CUP. All this is a different Chinese herb. Plus the capsule is the dry toad, and then CUP is the rhino skin. I'm not sure whether it's real rhino skin or not.
Well, that's another element to the story, right? Fakes are not a new phenomenon as well. Okay, thanks. And by the way, I'm happy to have interjections. I think this is quite good. It's interactive. Not to call for too many. I've got 10 minutes now before sharing the thoughts. So a couple of other points to give the context. So this species could have been called the Chinese or the Asian rhino, but it's called the Sumatran rhino because, as you might guess, the first one that was shot and scientifically described was yes by a white man from Europe. So he called it Rhinoceros sumatrensis because it was shot in Bengkulu, Sumatra. Otherwise it might have been called something else. So if I sort of fast forward, let's go to around 100 years ago, early years of the 20th century, a couple of points there. So number one, this so-called Sumatran rhinoceros was already critically endangered. I remember Rachel just sort of said earlier, by luck you looked at some years ago in the British North Borneo Herald and remember the story. So 100 years ago, it was known that this species globally, I mean anyone who thought about it knew it was on the verge of extinction. Point I might come back to later if I think about it. The other point was this, quite an important one in my view, is that the literature is a bit vague on this, but I think reading between the lines, what one finds is in southern Africa, or what we now call South Africa, where I've never been by the way, there are two other species of rhino, the so-called white and the black, and they were also on the verge of extinction. They had a whole long history. By the way, China started importing African rhino horn in the 1700s. So they'd already run out of rhinos on mainland Asia, so they were going as far as Africa. That's a bit of an aside. But the point was, in South Africa, a lot of land, whether you like it or not, I don't like it, was and still is privately owned. So farmers got together white and black rhinos from numbers that we now know are probably less than 1,000 each. There was less than 1,000 white and less than 1,000 black rhinos 140 years ago. And they farmed them and bred up numbers. So the thing you might have read about the last 20, 30 years about African rhinos being endangered with extinction from poaching is actually, in my view, not really true. The numbers now are much higher than they were 100 years ago, largely because of private landowners and then that restocked natural areas. But in Malaysia, and also Indonesia for that matter, intriguingly, despite having a very British and Dutch sort of background, the whole idea of private ownership of land for wildlife and private ownership of wild animals is not allowed even today. We assume it's normal, right? But I would like, in my NGO 40 years ago, to have bought Sumatran rhinos so we could manage them properly and breed them. But we were never allowed to because they had to be kept A, in a forest reserve and B, managed by the government. So there's that big difference which I'll sort of leave aside with you, that how governance is set up and ownership of land and wildlife actually has a big impact on whether species go extinct or not. So our last time is going on, so I'll pick out a few other bits and pieces.
No need to rush, it's a small crowd, so it's a quality crowd, so say whatever you want.
Wow, okay, thank you for that. Boost.
Here.
Wow, okay, seconded, thank you. So, oh yeah, a few other bits and pieces. So one is I should have introduced, Rachel gave me the invitation to tell me about myself, I didn't. So I started as a young biologist in Malaysia, in Pahang, Malaya, as I like to call it, in 1975, studying mammals, and my first survey looking for Sumatran rhinos was in 1977 in Johor. And then I moved over to Sabah and joined WWF in 1979, and I'm still here. But why I said that was something happened in 1980 that I realized in retrospect was very profound in the wildlife conservation world. Isn't widely known, and I think it is very profound. So even though in my earlier days as a young teenager, early 20s, I never thought about it, but I thought the idea of conserving wildlife was an ethical and moral thing. We did it because 99% of people have no interest, but some of us do. 1% of the whole population do. It should be allowed as a passion and as an ethical thing, save wildlife. But in 1980, a document came out called the World Conservation Strategy. I still have a copy of this printed thing, pre-digital age. It was jointly put out by IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, WWF, FAO, United Nations Development Programme, and UNEP. And very clearly, if you read the opening paragraphs, the purpose of wildlife conservation is to support human welfare. It's hidden away, it's not explicit, but it's very clear. And right up to date, when I write grants as an NGO, I have to write proposals for funding. Usually nowadays you have to put who is the beneficiary, right? And it has to be indigenous people, LGBT, women. You're not allowed to put animals. No, you have to put who are the human beneficiaries. So the whole trend I see over the last 40 years has gone away from an ethical, not private, but small-scale, passionate thing to do, to something that governments and international agencies do wildlife to support human welfare. I just mention that because it's, in my view, undermined the whole sphere of wildlife management globally. I'll leave that aside. So with that background, I was in Sabah in 1980, and it was clear there was a few, let's call them Sumatran rhinos left, mostly in the Lahadatu region. And I had this letter right up to today in a file at home. So the letter was from the Forest Department. I had an office in the Forest Department. There was no Wildlife Department yet. And the letter went to IUCN in Switzerland suggesting that these rhinos be captured because they were doomed if left in the wild. And the IUCN reply in 2 letters was, no, don't do it, it's too risky. So straight away, you see the beginning of some of my concerns. You're not doing something because it's too risky or because you don't think it'll work. What's your reason? Anyway, the point was that the Forest Department said, okay, we won't catch any rhinos. We will legislate Tabing Wildlife Reserve. So some good came out of it, but the argumentation for legislating Tabing Wildlife Reserve was to save the Sumatran rhino. But even in that time, 1980, the number of rhinos was too small to be viable. Which maybe I'm going to skip ahead. Thank you for your endorsement of taking my time. I'm going to leave a little bit of history out, I think, and go on to maybe two aspects of human endeavor, which are relevant to everything I've just said. So the first one are the biological aspects of wildlife, and I'm going to mention a few concepts which I hope are not too sort of technical or deep, but they so much underpin the wrong approach humans have to wildlife conservation, I believe now. So one would be this, that there's a concept in biology which I learned 45, 50 years ago, called the species area curve. The species area curve. So if you can imagine a graph, and sort of like there's a graph like that, right? So along there is size of habitat, and it could be. So the habitat, it could be the whole. It could be Southeast Asia, it could be Borneo, it could be Sabah, it could be Tabing Wildlife. It doesn't matter. So on that axis, so it's relative, it's ranking, it's not actually numbers. and up there is the number of species in that area. And what you get is I think the right around, I think it goes that way, something like that. And this is done empirically from studies in the 1960s, 70s and early 80s when the concept went out of fashion. But what it shows is that whatever size of area you start with, if you destroy a half of it, and destroy is a rough word, but let's think of Sumatra, which has roughly half forest and half other things, then you will lose 10% of species. It's just an empirical thing. You can't really say why, but the reason is to do with the rarest or the biggest animals or the most specialized need much bigger areas to sustain breeding populations. So if the smaller the area you have, Sepilok, you've been at Sepilok all the time, right? I do remember when there were elephants, would you believe there was elephants there in 1981, right? But they never came back again. It's just too small. Why would elephants go there? Because there's nothing there. And I think there's no more clouded leopards probably there, right?
No more
They would have been 100, really?
No more sun
So 100 years ago they would have been,
100 years
right?
ago we still got sun bears, but no more.
So it's 4,300 hectares, right? And the reason it's just too small.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to summarize that point. And it's very fundamental because what it means is that some species, such as the Sumatra rhino, are going to go extinct anyway. They're going to go extinct. It's part of this empirical curve. Unless humans do what the common word nowadays is interventions. You do something. Which of course you can, right? I mean, we breed cattle, goats, sheep, pigs. We can also breed rhinos. South Africa did that. Now they have about 20,000 white rhinos, up from about 150. The same thing never happened with the Sumatra rhinos. Those interventions could be done, but they never were. So bear with me for just a minute. You don't have to remember this, there won't be any test, but a few other things which are generally applicable, but are very, very applicable to the Sumatra rhino case. So number one would be this, another very fundamental one. Most of the wildlife literature, whether it's government, SAMA, federal, whether it's WWF, any organization, they're always on about the numbers. Everyone wants to know the numbers. So the common one is how many tigers there are, which by the way go extinct because it's the same trajectory of rhinos. So all those millions of ringgit being spent are a waste of money, you might as well let it go extinct. But my point is that it's not the numbers, it's the density of the population. So if you have, it doesn't matter if you have 100 or 1,000, but if they're all scattered all over the place and not breeding, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what there are. So whenever you see, there's so many 160 tigers left, it's irrelevant. It's the population density that counts, that's number one. And then there's things linked to that. The next thing I would say is demography. I mentioned that earlier, right? So if you imagine, I'm sure you read this literature, the demography of, say, Japan and Italy is very much weighted now towards older people, China as well. Some poorer countries, the demography is young people. So, the numbers don't really count. What you need to see is a population where there's young being born every year. Sumatran rhino, there might have been like one young being born once per year at the most over the last 100 years. That's not enough, right? I'm just talking random, one birth every year for 100 years is nothing, it might as well be zero. So there's nothing, there's the population density, there's the demography, and the other thing which applies very much to these rhinos, but to all mammals, is to do with reproductive pathology. So you find with mammals, including humans, those, I'm not treading too much on sensitive ground, but those who not produce babies, they tend to get pathologies, and it happens particularly in males as well, but mainly in women. You get what they call fibroids, you get cysts, Lyme-Lymes and whatnot. And it's a phenomenon of large mammals. Once they reach sexual maturity, which in the case of the Sumatra rhino is about 5 years old for a female, and over the last decades, most females didn't breed because there weren't any males nearby. So they build up this pathology, which is why most of the Sumatra rhinos that died in the last 50 years, the females died ultimately because of age-related reproductive pathology. That's the main reason. So whether you poach them doesn't really matter because they're going to die without breeding anyway. So I'm going to just sort of round down now and have a quick look at my notes. Before the other element of human endeavour, before we see the documentary. And remember, this is all the context. I want you to bear at least some of what I've said in mind before you see this excellent but emotional documentary. And it's what I've called in the title, what did I use the title? Cognitive biases or whatever. And I've got a whole list. I wrote a book on this rhino species. So it's a reality, and almost we don't realize it, I think. Everything we do or say or think is based on opinions and emotions. There's almost nothing we do is based on rational analysis. So I'm going to give you a number of cognitive biases that I have seen with this wretched Sumatra rhino over the last 50 years. So one is what I call avoidance bias, which means people avoid difficult topics. It's not only Malaysians, you know, in Putrajaya that avoid difficult topics. We all avoid difficult topics. So the key topics are not just...
It's a human thing.
It is a human thing, is that right? Another I call boiling frog bias.
Yeah.
Some of you know this, right? So what it is, so if you go from year to year, again the rhinos, right, you don't see any difference. There are like 10 rhinos, 10, 10, 10, 9. But if you look at the big picture over 100 years, you've seen there was a potentially viable population and then a population that's totally unviable. And the human mind doesn't think in that way. We tend to think year by year. So this so the boiling frog means that eventually the problem gets so severe that it's too late. Another obvious one, I call it emotionalization bias, and I'm going to mix it up with several other biases, but it's to do with the fact so when the 3 last rhinos in summer died, and that's sort of featured somewhat in the documentary, not explicitly, the news went global. It was not only in Malaysia, but you had all sorts of people saying, oh, it's terrible. But they missed the point. The point was not that a rhino died in, say, 17th of May 2019, because we're all going to die eventually. That's not the point. The point was there was no system in place. So in the human endeavour, you know, we will all die, but there's a system in place, as Dr. Rupert, there's a sort of system, whether it's faulty doesn't matter, but there's a national system in place to deal with health, demography, aging, all those sort of issues, right? There isn't for any kind of wildlife. There certainly never was the Sumatra rhino. So the tragedy is that there's no system in place to manage the remaining population. It's all focused on this emotional thing about this animal has just died. So I'm going to mention 1 or 2 more. There's loads of them. There's dozens of biases. Another is naming bias. So one is the Sumatran rhino. So I would say, just as an example, the fact that all of Sumatra is Indonesia, right? One year we have 3 nations. Sumatra is 1 nation. So the Sumatran rhinos meant that pretty much all the funding from overseas over the last 40 years for that species went into Indonesia. It was wasted, which is another issue, right? But the main issue is that it went to Indonesia because everyone thought globally it's a Sumatran species. And I remember having arguments 10, 20 years ago with people in that international sphere. They said, oh, Malaysia, it's a hopeless case. That wasn't the issue. The issue was there's rhinos in Sumatra, Kalimantan and Sabah. There should have been one program to manage them, and there never was. So I'm going to mention just 1 or 2 other biases. Another one of my favorites is use of technology, displacement using technology. So many of us, at least 2 or 3 of you here, use camera traps. Maybe you don't that much, right? But we use camera traps. That means you put out cameras in the forest, and there's a mechanism, so you take a photograph and any animal goes past. And it sort of started to become popular late 1990s, about 25 years ago.
I first used it in 1994, 1992.
Oh, yeah, very early.
In Taiwan.
Oh, yeah, that's very early.
I'm the first one who used camera trap in Borneo in 1998.
Oh, that's very early. Well,
Borneo.
you wouldn't make a note of that, seriously. You wouldn't note of this other society.
Yeah, recorded.
Well, my point, no offence to you, which sounds offensive, is that there must be, in summer alone, there must be millions of images now, camera trap images, some with WWF, some with you, some with all sorts of other people, private individuals, One Stop Borneo as well. And unless those are used towards management, they're useless. Right, that's a bit of a rough thing to say, right? There are all these pictures, and they come out in public domain to do fundraising. In West Malaysia, it's now tigers, right? So every time there's a tiger with 2 cubs, it comes out. The species is doomed, like the Sumatra rhino was, but it's put out as a mother with a calf, with babies, and so there's hope. That's another word used. My point more was that I remember so this was only 2013, exactly 10 years ago. There was a big meeting in Singapore on this Sumatran rhino, convened by, you were there, convened by Singapore Zoo. There's about 110 people there, right? There's some people I never even knew who they were, and I drew up the list, they're all there, right? And there was, I don't know if you knew, but there was a scheme which came actually from Barney Long, Richard name, right? NWS, to put out 3,000 camera traps in Sumatra to estimate how many Sumatran rhinos there were. 3,000 camera traps, I mean that's much bigger than any project I've ever heard of. And the enormous cost, not only of putting them out, replacing batteries, some of them in the middle of nowhere, 3 days walk around. A totally ludicrous thing that came out of an international meeting. When we already knew in the 1920s the species is doomed, what do you need to do? Catch them all, put them under a program run by professionals to maximize the birth rate, right? That's all you need to do. But it got lost, and I said, actually it's not a big deal, but technology, and I use that as an example, can be used as a sort of displacement. Sort of, you're doing something, but it has a big purpose. And for completion, before showing the documentary, I also mentioned risk avoidance as a specific thing. So when I look back at my sort of now 40+ year time with this wretched species, it's preyed on my mind for so long. It's all great, there's been so many meetings, I've been to maybe 30, 40, 50 meetings over the years on this species, often involving Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia, by the way, won't talk to Sabah because it's a province, they only talk to Kuala Lumpur. So even though Kuala Lumpur has no legal status here or whatever, they had to talk to KL. Anyway, but my point was more that despite all that talking, there's really only 2 or 3 people who make any difference in the world. So one is the minister in charge of wildlife, which, as you'll understand, in the case of Malaysia, will tend to be the federal minister, whether we like it or not. Indonesia is now sitting on by Bakar, who's Minister of Environment and Forestry. And wildlife is just a little tiny part of her enormous ministry. She could have made a decision any time in the last 10 years. She's been in power now for 9 years exactly. May the 9th, 2014, she came as minister. To say, okay, let's go ahead. We're getting the best people. We get Dr. Zeiler from Bora. We get the IZW people from Berlin. We have a program. But she never did. And part of that is to do with her asking advice from, I won't mention the names, mainstream NGOs and International Union for Conservation of Nature said, oh, it's too risky, we need to do this, we need to do that. And often those people are not experts. They're doing their job because the recycling, the swinging door between government and business in many cases. And the other one, so the minister also relies on the head of wildlife, which in Sabah would be the Wildlife Department, and in Malaysia would be Kalitan, in Indonesia would be BKSDA, Balai Sumatra Alam. So all those few people who could make decisions instantly are all risk adverse. And their aversion is nothing to do with technical things. Humans can do everything, right? Everything is possible. Their aversion is because it's just too risky, right? They might get told off by WWF, or they might have Indonesia. They're literally worried about demonstrations on the streets sometimes. They're literally on catching rhinos. The Minister of Forestry 2013 told me he wouldn't endorse captured rhinos because they might be rioting in Jakarta. So it's to do with this sort of vague political, personal risk of being shown up to be wrong. Okay, so that's it. I see a few slightly droopy eyelids. Not that many. So now, without further ado, with that big context, we'll see this documentary. And I guess, depending on how things go, right, we should allow a bit of time for discussion thereafter, particularly on what happened. Bear in mind, what you're going to see covers the years 2013 to 2016. So that's 6-7 years ago now. Okay, are we ready? What do you expect? Number one is the government of USA through the State Department gave about $12 million to Indonesia to save the rhino. All that money's gone. It was frittered away in various NGOs to do surveys. Nat Geo linked up with some other donors in USA in 2017 to do yet another Save the Sumatran Rhino program. And it's dragged on for a long time. It was only early this year that the South African advisors said taking rhinos out by helicopter from mountain forests is too risky. But I don't blame them particularly. The government of Indonesia made it clear they don't want Malaysians or Germans involved. They don't like them. They only want Americans and their money, and Indonesians to get the glory for it to be so blunt.
Neutral.
Okay. So it goes on. So I should just mention, you may recall, so both all those rhinos died after this. So 2017, Punton was euthanized. She had a very rare cancer that originates from the roots of the molar teeth, previously only known from a few humans. Tan died in May, natural causes, kidney failure in May 2019. And Iman, basically that big glioma dislodged. It's actually called hypovolemic shock, I think, as Dr. Riley has got. I think it's to do with an enormous shock to the system when the glioma dislodged, so she died in November 2019. Christina Liu, our Minister of Tourism, again, was Minister of Tourism and Environment in 2019. She made a last-ditch attempt to meet her counterpart in Indonesia, Sitino Bakau, who was snubbed up, didn't show up for the meeting. Christina Liu's idea was to basically, come on, we got sperm, eggs, and cell cultures, work with us, but that was Indonesia decided to reject that idea. So that's sort of what happened. I monitor even now. I think the species will go extinct now. A policy decision to catch all the last rhinos from hatching, with the last wild ones, could save the species. As you understood from this documentary, breeding in captivity didn't work in the end, so it's impossible. The only hope sort of now is when the current government of Indonesia steps down next year, and we might get a new president and a new Minister of Forestry, they may say, okay, let's give it our last shot. The present government of Indonesia doesn't want to do anything. So that's it. Comments or questions? Welcome in the last remaining, well, a few more minutes, 10, 15 minutes maybe. If there's no questions, I won't be offended.
So back to the title of the talk. So the real reason for species extinction. And your suggestion on this is?
Oh, I mean, all the technical things could be done, right? I mean, Dr. Zhang and our team showed there was actually 2 rhinos were taken up by helicopter, as you may know, right? Indonesia decided it's too risky. I think they don't like to be shown up by Malaysians. Okay, but so to summarize that answer to that question, I think one can always keep moving on. It's like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and all sorts of people have done, whether you like them or not, right? You keep moving on rather than make excuses and not doing new things. So that's it in summary. Technically, the species could still survive, I reckon. So I'm going to make just one more. It's a bit off your main question, but to illustrate my point, things moving on. So I don't know if you know, but in 2016, the very first mammals, which is of course rats, right? It's always lamprey rats, were created in Japan, where both the sperm and the egg were made from skin cells from a male rat and a female rat. So it's technically possible to make gametes in the lab and make babies which are born without any problems. So that was one advance. The other is, I don't know how far the Germans have got, but they have cell cultures from the last 4 rhinos, those 3 and one other called Glogon, as does San Diego in USA. So the German team does have what they call induced pluripotent stem cells for those rhinos who now died, which means that sperm from Tan and eggs from the other 3 rhinos could be made in the lab. So all those things the potential is there, right? But you get risk-averse bureaucrats just on a whim say, oh, it's too risky. And that's 20 years of effort, $50 million in total. If you sort of see the big picture, it's probably gone down the road. Very
How long
irritating.
can you preserve the egg and the sperm from these 3 rhinos?
This is a non-one. Sperm almost indefinitely in liquid nitrogen, and that's well known, right, for humans. The problem with the eggs, they're much more sensitive, I guess. And the best way, actually I think that wasn't mentioned, but all the eggs that were taken out of the rhinos, they within 2 days had in vitro fertilization done. The risk is if you put mammal eggs in liquid nitrogen, when they thaw, they just burst. They don't always, but with so few precious ova, you don't want to do that. The safest way, oddly enough, is these cell cultures that I just mentioned. where you make cell cultures and then you keep them going in the lab. That's the most robust. Needs a lot of effort to maintain them free of fungi and virus and bacteria, but that's actually the most robust way of preserving cells, living cell cultures, rather than individual sperms or eggs.
3 quick questions. Number one, you said regarding rhinos and tigers and so on. I feel like they might go, both of them will go extinct sooner or later if there's no drastic measure taken place. But in the end, what I concluded, at least from a quick observation, from a neutral perspective, whatever you said today during your talk is basically human error. And even in the 1920s, when the rhinos were already, their birth rate was lower than death rate, it just shows that even if we had the smartest fellows then, let's say 1 smart fellow or 2 smart fellows in 1920s and 1940s.
See the same thing, right?
Same thing, huh? I mean, if we had a group of human beings, 20, 30 people, things might be different. And it looks like 100 years later, education.
You need governments.
Yeah, they need to be higher up, right?
Yeah, but 120 years later, maybe a group of. It just shows in the society the amount of people who might be thinking in this perspective. We haven't said the rhinos or any animal. Just saying, do you think in the end it is human perspective? How many John Paynes, Wong Siu-Tays or etc. can be there, right? And still, can they help species?
Getting very dangerously close to philosophy, isn't it?
Yes, that's why.
But if you believe, as I tend to, that we don't have any free will, well, that's a whole other philosophical thing. You could imagine that it doesn't matter, we do what we like and nothing will change. On the other hand, I'm going to boast a little about Bora, what we're doing. I'm a little tiny bit now, right? So in summary, my NGO now, we plant orangutan food plants in oil palm plantations because we think orangutans are savvy and intelligent enough to live in oil palm if they have enough food. So that's one thing ongoing. Slow progress. So far, about 7,000 food plants planted and survived in 8 different estates in Kinabatangan district. And the other is planting grasses for wild cattle in Perak and Taming Wildlife Reserve on the understanding that wild cattle, of which there's 2 species, one in Borneo and West Malaysia, their limiting factor ultimately is grass. They can get everything else like minerals and water, but they need grass because that's what they're evolved to do. And there's not much grass in rainforest. So a lot of our stuff, some of the stuff you saw there, spend a lot of time. Actually, we started a year and a half ago planting grass. But what we found is that it's more productive to pull out weeds that are not grass than the grass will grow. That's little thing. You know that way, yeah. Okay.
Why did all the last 3 rhinos got illness? Was it due to the old age or lack of nutrition in the jungle? I mean, lack of food in the jungle or drinking polluted water or...
Okay, you're dangerously close to getting me starting on another rant. So it's actually age-related. Age-related. All those were to do with old age. And no one knows how long this rhino on average will live, but we think 30 to 35 years is sort of normal range. And probably we underestimated the age. If you remember, we estimated Iman was 15, but actually I think she would have been older to build up that lifetime. But you did touch on nutrition. So there's one little anecdote which sort of proves the point. So all those rhinos that we looked after in Tamin for several years, their body weight started to decline if we did not give them 300 grams of horse pellets every day. And I'm nodding, but the implication is that they're very close to the edge in their natural diet. They're struggling to get enough nutrition, particularly minerals, right, which will be limiting in natural vegetation, which probably also isn't good for their health, but also slows down the birth rate. It will slow down the cycling. It will make bearing and pregnancy more difficult. So there's another element not mentioned that I think probably for large herbivorous mammals in tropical rainforest, they're very close to the edge in terms of nutrition, probably calcium, phosphorus, and sodium also. So that might also just dampen the whole population's ability to reproduce. Probably.
I see. Well, is it like the lack of nutrition due to the deforestation or what?
No, that's another funny thing. So, another story. So at the end of the Pleistocene, we came into the Quaternary, the big things were sea level rises, global warming, predating humans, and more rain.
Right.
So what happened in Borneo, or Southeast Asia, you got dipterocarp forest, which you probably know, right, which is closed canopy, meaning that only about 1% of the light coming to the top goes to the bottom.
I see.
And as you all know, right, one is heavy rain leaches the soil, and lack of light really slows down. I mean, there's no growth if there's no light. So the productivity, right, not the species, but the productivity of plant food is actually very, very low on the forest floor. So it's sort of all right for things. It's not so bad, say, for bears, orangutans that eat fruits and a bit of young leaves and insects, but for ground-dwelling herbivorous mammals, that's an issue for them.
Sorry for my ignorance, because I don't
I'm
know
sure you're not ignorant.
because I don't know the whole background of the rhino IVF program and so on. Is the German team partially to be blamed as well, because maybe you trusted them for their competence and everything, and maybe they didn't deliver, number one. Number two, even though you have stored all the sperm or the eggs and so on, maybe the technology doesn't exist right now. Do you think one day down the line, maybe 3, 4 decades or 5 decades from now, things might be more advanced? Let's say whether one day there's a Jurassic Park or something, they might save bring back the rhinos or something, not just the mammoths but the Sumatran rhino. So these were my final two ignorant questions.
Okay, so number one, I don't know if this is being recorded, right? But anyway,
I can delete it.
the Germans are the best in the world in this overall as a team, right? And they work as a team, they don't function. But they are very Germanic, and Malaysians are robust enough to withstand their sort of rather blunt and sometimes sarcastic attitude. Indonesians are not. so they're not, it's mainly their Germanic manner. I think that is the answer. But technically they're very good, they're cutting edge. There's a few people I should mention, right? If you remember, there's a bull man who took the oocytes out. He's Italian, so he's sort of the world expert on safely getting egg cells out of large mammals. He happens to be Italian. And the man, the short man, very religious looking man, is actually Indonesian, and he's a world expert in taking one sperm, as you saw in the injecting it into an egg cell. You think only Europeans do that. No, there's an Indonesian man who's equally good, but Indonesia didn't really like him helping Malaysia, so they didn't support him. So all those human factors come into play, right? Human jealousy and resentment sort of come into play. On the other part of it, I think your question was, I mean, almost anything is possible. I haven't tracked. So that the Italian man said if it was up to him, he would put those embryos, if he could make them, into very large horses because they're the same general grouping, and the reproductive biology, especially cloning and in vitro fertilization for horses, is very well known, but is not very well known for African rhinos. So that would have been his recommendation if things had proceeded. But another thing that could happen is artificial uteruses. That would be another probable. Whether anyone will ever want to go to the bother of doing it, I suspect it's not really worth bothering doing it. But that's another option that will probably be possible in the future. And this is more possible. Now, funny enough, the German team actually got mixed up in something. It's some project that's called Gigantic or something, which want to bring back mammoths.
Yes,
So they actually, I don't know. I mean, depending on either they're mad or it's too cutting edge.
But that's how genius says can get these work.
Anyway, yeah.
You can call them
that
mad.
seems foolish because the body size of mammoths and elephants is quite a big difference. And then there's big mammoths that evolved for a very cold climate, right? Ranging over enormous areas in icy areas rather than. Now you've started me. So another problem with these Sumatran rhinos is they're very close to. I can't remember the term now. The combination of their body mass, the ratio of their surface area to mass is quite small. They're very compact, right? So if you get, I've looked into this, if you get to temperatures at which we're approaching in summer now, 35, 36 degrees with 90% humidity, they can't function, they'll die of heat stroke. So they're very much on the evolutionary edge of that sort of body size being able to survive in humid climates. That's a bit different from what you asked, but what I'm getting towards is you need to look at these sort of factors as well as whether it's man or not, whether there's actually makes sense in terms of temperature, nutrition, where you can put them. Sumatran rhino, I think, would be doable. Mammoths, I tend to think not. More interesting are thylacines, if you know this case, in the sense that, as you know, thylacines being marsupials, they get born when they're really tiny. So manipulating them, you know, in the lab is going to be much easier than large placental mammals. It's going into too much detail there.
Yeah. Well, I got a few questions. So back in 2005, if you recall, that we are having this rhino survey in Ghana.
I recall it, yes.
Yeah, at that time, the results, yes, with the result was like, there was like what, 13 rhino?
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that in greater, and then it was a sharp decline over the years. What do you think happened?
Okay, I think there's two things that came together, and we always like to have one thing. So number one, that was an overestimate. When I re-looked at that data, there was a lot of wishful thinking, right? I even looked at some of the photos that Raymond Alfred compiled. Rhino footprints, I think it's just sort of pigs in the shape of rhino. So some of them were not rhinos, that's one thing. There's a lot of wishful thinking. And even Alan Rabinovitz, who'd done a similar survey, I don't know, early 92.
Yeah,
So about 15 years earlier, right? He did the same thing. When I looked at his original data, there was some wishful thinking. He sort of boosted that there's probably one or two there, there's a young one there for the adults, and still that sort of thing. So that's one. But the other thing was, we did see the last deaths, I think, in Sumatra and Down Valley. If you remember, if you know Dr. Hamid, who some of you know, right? Who started off as what was UKM summer in 1990.
Yeah, studying rhino foot habits.
He saw a mother and infant. I think the infant might have been Iman. That's what I think now. That was 1990, right? What I mean is that the last few rhinos were dying of age-related problems over the last 20, 30 years in Ghana. So you know what I mean? One was the overestimate. The other was, there were several which were sort of dying over the period 1995, 2000, 2005, 2000.
But do you think poaching play a role, like people setting snares, say for example, Iman's three-legged situations and there's sort of bears, got snares, all these things.
Yeah, that did play a role, But what I say, I think it hastened the inevitable extinction, is my view. It played a role, but it sort of speeded up.
But if you think that the rhino are doomed, like long time ago, just like you mentioned, and why bother to save like create more out and all the effort?
That goes on to the current the World Conservation Strategy view, right? The purpose of wildlife is to support human welfare. If you take that view, then it's best not to save the tiger or one of those things. I think that's philosophical rather than rational.
And at the beginning at the talk, you mentioned about 100 years ago, the people already know that certain species that are already endangered. But at the time, there wasn't any very, very few wildlife research. At times, the forest is contiguous. At times, the human population is low.
Yes.
I mean, how does those people know that these animals is endangered by looking at there's no wildlife research?
I understand exactly what you're saying. I find it very difficult to say. So there is a lot of scattered literature, some books, some journals, some in Dutch, which I can't read. From the year, let's say 1880 up to 1940, the Second World War, right? And every single author says this animal is almost extinct.
How do they know? I mean, right now we're using...
I know. No, they know because... this is another thing. So, Sumatran rhinos, they're 500 kilos. They have 3 footprints, and they wallow every day. If they're there, it's easy to find them. It's easy to find them. People think they're difficult to find, but the reason is because there aren't any. That's why they think difficult to
But
find.
at times there are so few people in the forest.
Compared to the yes, but
we're looking at logging in Sarawak, for example, started when?
on a big scale, I guess 1960s.
Yeah,
1960s
so
on a big scale.
prior 1960s,
Yeah,
the forest in Sabah is still contiguous and there are very few people, and then in Sabah we don't have the forest dwelling people.
yeah,
Like the Punans, all the nomadic tribal, we don't have it there. We don't have it here.
yes, sure, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
And how does people know? That's my question.
I don't think, that's why I said I find it difficult. I know exactly what you're saying. I find it a difficult answer, except to say they're a big animal, and it's very obvious. If there were a lot, I mean, everyone who went in the forest would keep seeing them. Like this
Maybe
the
they
others
talk
are
to
important.
people.
Yeah, and at the
Talk to
time,
locals.
people, I mean, there are very few, I mean, relatively few people, and relatively few people who are interested on wildlife conservation. I mean, the word
No, not
conservation
about
to the point.
conservation, but about
Food,
the
yeah.
number of animals that are around that are.
Yeah,
I can probably answer that.
yes.
Well,
Because I
okay.
saw that
Oh.
article. The article is not about conservation. The article is how many things they have hunted.
Right.
So they're basically saying, oh, we got how many of this, how many of that.
Yeah.
Oh, we got very few
Uh,
rhinos because there are fewer and fewer of them. It's not a conservation work.
yeah, I know.
So basically they are saying that it's more and more difficult to hunt them.
I think
That's
that's the insight. It doesn't answer you. I mean, we'll never know, right? You could you could go along with that and say no, not many people. They didn't really know. Not many people writing. There might have been lots of rhinos. In which case, I suppose the explanation is more the classical one. Poaching and habitat loss was the problem, isn't it? That's the sort of classical explanation.
Right.
Poaching and habitat loss.
Right.
Well, I tried to say earlier that the poaching and habitat loss has been going on for thousands of years, right? It's not like it's sort of suddenly happened in the last century. That's
No,
what I was trying to say.
Well, if you look at human population growth, and just in the last century, where after the industrial revolutions, the human population grew all shoot up because of, and then when there are more people, of course, more than the places like Sabah, for example, just like say Borneo, for example, the logging started in the 60s, and within like 60 years, half of the Borneo gone. Look at Sarawak, what happened.
Yeah.
And then Thailand, say for example, started early in the last centuries, and most of the forest gone. So deforestation, I think, play important roles.
Yes, you're going to, yeah.
Play important roles.
Okay.
Hunting and poaching play important roles. Yeah.
This is not again. It's not answering your point,
Yeah.
but it's nothing. So the rhinos we found in Tamin, they cannot survive on closed canopy rainforest plants. They will only eat the fast-growing secondary ones like macrophecus, implying that they're not really well adapted to forest.
Yeah.
I said that because your sort of argument tended towards loss of forest being an important element in the story.
Yeah, but again, if you just like you mentioned about the closed canopy forest in Taiwan, after the first round of logging back in the 80s, the selective logging, isn't it? They create a lot of openings.
Yes, sure, yeah.
And in theory, rhino should try to do pretty well.
Yeah, but there weren't enough.
There weren't
I mean,
enough.
there were so few left. And again, going back to my point, right? The demography was wrong. There were too many old ones. They were, and it's 120,000 hectares, right? They don't necessarily know where each other are. They depend on, the smell and the hearing. They need to get within, a few tens of meters to know to meet each other.
And then also one last question, I promise.
Right.
Now you did mention something about, like, long time ago, the people already know that the rhino have their reproduction tract have cysts, developed cysts.
Yes.
When was this cyst first discovered?
Okay, I'd say the very, you can always say something else, but the key one was 1987.
Okay, so it was really the first round of
Captures.
Of captures.
Yes. What I didn't mention was that there was an agreement, I used to brokered agreement for Indonesia, West Malaysia, Sabah, US zoos and British zoos to work together. Of course they said they would, but they never did. So Indonesia signed agreements with British zoos and American zoos.
Right.
Malaysia didn't want to export rhinos, so they didn't get called right. So the captures in Bengkulu, Riau province. So one was captured, a sort of middle-aged female, and she was sent to zoo in UK, we got the name right, and found there through ultrasound to have quite big lions already. So she already had it in the wild. So that was the first sort of signal, right, that wild female rhinos have reproductive problems. But the bigger picture was Nan Schaefer, who you may remember,
Yes, I know that, yeah.
who kept compiling from 1987 up to 2000, and found and published that 70% of all the 40 rhinos are called, roughly half are females, right? 20 in that 10-year time frame. At least 70% had severe liomas or cysts, and she found that out by year 2000. If you ask in the time frame, so relatively recent, but not very recent.
And then those few that was captured in West Malaysia, say for example, Mina's mother.
Yeah.
Mina was born in Sumatra.
Yes.
And then her mom got cysts at the time, or
I don't really. Yeah, it was checked. I don't know offhand. Probably not in that case.
Yeah.
She would have been checked. Yeah, Nan Schaefer amongst others did that, right?
Yeah.
Right. Vigorously.
Well, Dr. Wong, I have a comment on your remark just now when you said,
I'll
right?
get back to it with it. So.
Oh no, you want to ask us?
No,
Yes, she's been trying to talk.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, what's your question?
No, it's probably not very relevant. I was just, yeah,
Raise the topic,
it's,
doesn't have to be a question.
I'll mention later on.
Right.
Check with you later.
No, when you said just now, like, if we know the death rate is this much and the birth rate is so much, is it worth saving the rhino and so on? But then we can ask a bigger question, and I don't have the answer to that. I'm just asking, maybe you know better, or John, you know better, others know better. Let's say, for example, sun bears, right? I love sun bears. Can't prove it as much as the man himself next to me. But let's say, my personal experience of sun bears, let's say in Tower Hills, where I have been there for 7 years, I think from my records of camera trapping, they could be between 2 to 11 sun bears. And in Taraja, Brunei, maybe around 11 bears. In some of the places I've been in Kalimantan, Sarawak, 0 bears, I think. And the population maybe is going down because I've seen hunting and so on. Question about not just bears, let's say it is a hyper-endemic stick insect, or a frog species, which we're not talking about, right? We're only talking about big stuff, right? Because that's cool, right? And sexy. All these smaller stuff. Let's say this is a hyper-endemic begonia, only found and so on. And we know it's going to go extinct because this place is not protected. Is it worth protecting this stick insect or sun bear or so on? I mean, from that big picture, because he just pointed it out and he has the right point. And I think about it too, right? I mean, just throwing in an idea.
Again, going back to the philosophy, right? But I'll give another example. This may be the last one with any luck. So there's something called the European bison. Who's American bison? European bison, right? So the last wild one was killed in what is now Georgia, not USA, Georgia, whatever that place is, south of Russia, right?
Oh, the Tbilisi.
Something around there. 1927. Leaving 12, right, a total of 12 in zoos in what is now Germany, Poland and Hungary. So without any molestation by governments or NGOs, doesn't exist, right? Zoo directors got together and landowners and decided to save the species, and they did, right, by captive breeding in zoos. And as you may know, there's now 7,500, most of them in the wild, reintroduced into the wild in Eastern Europe. But my point more was, it's down to passionate individuals. And the problem now is that governments and international institutions and some NGOs interfere and try to stop people doing what they want to do. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you very much.
And I'm not an anarchist, by the way. Okay, thank you.
Right, so thank you very much.
Oh, it's not my book, so it's okay.
That is okay.
Very
So
much,
this is.
I got one here, one here.
Alright.
1, 2, 3.
Did I give you one earlier?
Wait.
Okay. Oh no. Okay. So thank you very much for giving us the talk.
Yeah,
It was
thanks
very
for having me.
educational.
Yeah.